Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome to this OSRL webinar on wildlife response in the incident management system. My name is Paul Kelway and I'm the Wildlife Preparedness and Response Manager here at Oil Spill Response. So this is the next installment in a series of wildlife response theme webinars that we've been offering over the last year or so. And this time we're focusing on the integration of wildlife response into the incident management system. In an incident management system, responsibilities for wildlife response are often designated to a wildlife branch within the operations section of the command structure and are generally overseen by a wildlife branch director. This branch serves as a vital connecting point between wildlife response operations and the wider incident management. And although that's well established in certain countries, the potential scale of wildlife response operations and certainly its impact on and needs from the wider incident management can often mean that it's underestimated, especially in larger incidents. So in this session, we're going to be looking at that, and we'll explore the theory and structure behind the wildlife branch. We'll look at how it's been applied in various incidents around the world, and also the importance of pre-planning in a successful incident response. To do that, I'm delighted to be joined today by three highly experienced wildlife response managers, Rich Davey, Dr. Michael Zaccardi, and Dr. Valeria Ruopolo. Rich Davey joined ExxonMobil in 1987 and is currently an environmental scientist responsible for oil spill modeling, wildlife response plan preparation, and environmental support as it relates to exploration and development projects. He's an active member of ExxonMobil's regional response team and serves as an environment unit leader. He's also an instructor for ExxonMobil's University of Spill Management and is the chair of the Wildlife Response Preparedness Community of Practice Group, which is a technical forum involving a number of OSRL's members and other stakeholders. So Rich will start us off and he'll be presenting on the theory and structure behind wildlife response in the incident management system. Followed by Mike Zaccardi. So Mike has been an oil spill veterinarian and coordinator since 1996, responding to more than 50 spills in the US and abroad, including as the marine mammal and sea turtle group leader for the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. His current positions at the University of California, Davis are Executive Director of the One Health Institute, Director of the Wildlife Care Network, and Health Science Clinical Professor. Dr. Zaccardi was also the former chair of the Global Wildlife Response System, or GWRS, steering group, and Mike today will be presenting on wildlife response in practice during an incident. And then finally, Valeria Ruopolo is the director of IUCA, a consultancy providing specialized wildlife response and preparedness services in Brazil, which was founded in 2010. Valeria is also a veterinarian and an experienced wildlife rehabilitator, and has been a key member of the management team in oil spills all over the world. And Valeria is the current vice chair of the GWRS steering group and will be presenting today on international considerations in wildlife response management. We'll hopefully also leave some time for questions. The Q&A is open, so if you have questions as you go along, please feel free to put those in the chat. We might not have time to answer everything, but we'll certainly do our best to find some time at the end to answer some of those questions. So without further ado, I'd like to hand things over now to Rich Davey to kick things off by talking about the theory behind wildlife response management. Rich, thanks very much. Over to you.
So thank you very much, Paul. Can you see my my presentation up there, just to make sure?
I can, looking good.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about wildlife response in the incident management system. So the summary in this presentation, what I'm going to talk about is what is wildlife response. And I'm also going to talk about wildlife response in the incident command or incident management system, wildlife branch responsibilities and organizational structure, training and qualifications for the wildlife branch director. I'm going to talk a little bit about pre-planning for wildlife response, and then touch on global good practices. So what is wildlife response? Well, it's basically the combination of activities that we follow to minimize the impacts of an oil spill on wildlife, such as birds, mammals, reptiles, by both prevention of oiling where possible and mitigating the effects on individuals when oiling has taken place. One of the documents that we use are the key principles for the protection, care, and rehabilitation of oil wildlife. It's an IPCA document and has been very useful, and I use it regularly. Wildlife response strategies. Primarily, we want to keep the oil away from the animals using a number of different measures, surveillance and monitoring. Secondary, keep the animals away from oiling, and that's through hazing and deterrence, displacement, so preemptive capture. I believe Valeria is going to talk a little bit about that later. And then the tertiary response strategy of mitigating impact on oiled animals, and that covers the care and rehabilitation. So wildlife in the incident command or incident management system, both terms are the same. It's just and the structure is the same. So where does wildlife response fit into the ICS IMS system? You're looking at basically the organizational charts. So the wildlife branch is typically in the operations section of the unified command for an oil spill response. And in where my company operates, we typically have someone also in the planning section. A wildlife plan details the wildlife branch's purposes, goals, objectives, responsibilities, and the structure of how a response is going to take place. And that structure may be expanded or contracted to fit the need. You know, a larger spill is going to need more people. A smaller spill, maybe not so many of the branches, but the mission is going to remain unchanged. Stakeholders in a unified command. Typically, you want to make sure that you have participation with all of the important agencies involved. In a unified command, you have the responsible party. That's the organization responsible for the incident. You may have federal officials. That could be in North America, that would be the U.S. government agencies. In other countries, it would be the ministries, etc. You can have state or local officials that are also included. Participation in a unified command is going to vary according to national or regional requirements. In some areas, it's required that the lead is taken by that nation or region. In other areas, it's allowable for the responsible party to be in the lead. But in a unified command, you have equal representation in the decision making. All operational objectives are jointly approved, and you have a single command post. If you have multiple command posts, that can cause some friction between objectives. Wildlife branch responsibilities and deliverable. Although the wildlife branch sits in operations, there's a clear linkage to planning and communication with the environmental unit leader. Typically, agencies or ministry representatives will be sitting within the environmental unit in planning, so it's important to have a liaison for wildlife from planning over to operations. Initial wildlife response is reactive and is coordinated by the wildlife branch. Longer-term plans may be needed, so you have the planning team involved in setting that up. Planning an effective oil wildlife response is going to require input and cooperation from many stakeholders, including administrators, oil wildlife response experts like my colleagues Michael and Valeria, oil spill response experts, competent authorities, and most of those people are sitting within the environmental unit. A well-designed plan can provide a direction to achieve effective, responsible, and cost-efficient approach to caring for oil-affected wildlife. Other responsibilities of the wildlife branch, the director's responsibilities include minimizing injuries to wildlife and habitats during a response, coordinating aerial and ground reconnaissance of wildlife, searching where they are, advising wildlife protection strategies and rehabilitating injured wildlife. That is key. Ensuring the removal of oiled carcasses. Removing of the carcasses helps to keep any other animals from being impacted when they're scavenging. Employing hazing measures to be able to scare animals away from the potential of being impacted, keeping them in the cleaner areas. And coordinating activities of wildlife care groups and other stakeholders. Coordination is important to a successful response. A large-scale wildlife response may have 5 groups within the wildlife branch: wildlife reconnaissance, hazing, recovery, field stabilization, and wildlife care and processing. And those are the people who are going to rehabilitate the collection and deal with the collection of the animals. A typical organizational chart for the wildlife branch: you'll have the wildlife branch director, and he or she will have a deputy to assist the operation. These are the other groups, the 5 groups that I just spoke of, the reconnaissance group, and that will be broken up depending on what is needed. And the same with care and processing. Field stabilization: do you want the animals to be stabilized before they come in into the rehabilitation facility? A recovery group, and then a deterrent and hazing group if that is necessary. Most of these wildlife roles are going to be filled by contracted wildlife response organizations, and that's going to be incident specific. Typically, the branch director or the deputy are going to be a representative of the responsible party, and the other will be someone from one of the responsible agencies, but be it federal or state level. Training qualifications for a branch director. Branch director needs to be trained in ICS, IMS. That's important because essentially he or she is a manager. Have emergency operations training in hazardous materials, because that's typically what we are dealing with. Competent knowledge of the regional wildlife. Experience in wildlife surveying and monitoring, offshore, coastal, inland. Having some information and understanding of the region you're working in is pretty important. Experience or good working knowledge of bird, mammal capture methods, because having the right methods to capture animals is important to reduce additional injury to them. Experience in wildlife rehabilitation methods. Each species has specific requirements, and it's important to know what those requirements are. Training or experience in the method of management of oil wildlife. Again, the branch director is going to be a manager, and it's important they're able to handle all of the issues that come up. Experience in actions to protect wildlife in severe events. An oil spill is typically a very severe event, and having some experience in that helps. And good communication skills is important, because you've got to be able to get your message across to the people that are working with you, and also to be able to give that to the stakeholders. Now, most of my information is very North American centric because that's where I'm based, but I have had some experience internationally. So stakeholders across the world are pretty typical at the different levels. Stakeholders are resource trustees. So you have federal, you have state, you have tribal, local community. You may have non-government organizations or NGOs, environmental and public interest groups like the Nature Conservancy or the Audubon Society. Community stakeholders, so governors, mayors, ministers, property owners, and citizens may be involved in one way or another. The important thing here is you want to engage these people early and get their opinion so that you're starting off on the right foot. We've already had a bad incident. The best way to make it go easier is to get them on your side. Now, one important thing is pre-planning in wildlife response, because that's important. Basic preparedness is critical to the success of any emergency response. Responding to wildlife issues requires advanced planning for trained personnel, equipment, and facilities. You don't want to be behind the gun and have to wait until things happen before you start figuring out what it is that you need. Pre-plans define the objectives of a wildlife response and a mutually agreed way between the responsible party and the stakeholders on how impacted wildlife is going to be handled. That's best undertaken before anything ever happens. I mean, we call it in peacetime because everybody's emotions are at a nice even level and decisions work a lot better that way. These pre-plans provide a clear understanding of best practices and the associated protocols. They also integrate into the overall oil spill response plan so that access to response resources is faster and the focus can be on tactics instead of on trying to figure out how we're going to do it. They also improve public and media understanding of the responsible parties' commitment to protecting the environment, as well as reaffirming local and national priorities. Because from one country to another, the priorities may be very, very different. The structure of a wildlife plan, well, the challenge is to develop a document that clearly explains what the plan aims to do, why, when, how, and by whom. Provide clear and straightforward operational instructions. Provide key data to enable efficient and effective decision making, and seamlessly integrates with existing response plans. So that's how the operational team will work and how any of the other teams are going to work. Everything has to be integrated so that there's no conflicts. Ideally, the plan is going to be broken into 3 sections. The strategy, which is the geographic limits of the plan, vulnerable species and habitats, personnel, equipment, and facilities. Then you have the operations, notifications, response priorities, procedures, and steps for escalation. You can start off with a small incident and that can quickly balloon into something much, much larger. And having the right notifications, getting the right agencies and ministries involved early on is also important. And then there's the data section. Those are the maps, the checklists, the forms, and triage criteria. That's essentially your toolbox. How are you going to do things and what you're going to use to do them. And then this is just a basic table of contents for a wildlife response plan. I'm not going to go into this, but this is pretty standard from one plan to another. And these are the different types of things. Safety considerations are important, protecting the people that are involved as well as the animals. The primary branch activities, any potential species that may be affected. Having that beforehand helps speed things along. And then how the response is going to take place, and then personnel management, because there are a lot of people involved, particularly in a lengthy response. And then we're looking at doing a global approach. There was a conference workshop that was sponsored by IPECA and the GOWRS, or Global Oil Wildlife Response System network of responders. And this took place in Nicosia, Cyprus at the end of 2019. And through this workshop, we came out with some ideas of the importance of developing plans and capability, defining key measures for industry and individual companies, as well as exploring existing wildlife response capabilities at a global, regional, and local level. We identified gaps in readiness, as well as explored ways to advance corporate programs. It's important that industry be involved in all of this so that we know how to respond and how to respond effectively, efficiently, and the same in standard practices. Some provided recommendations through IPECA came out of this for industry, for the service providers that were involved, some non-industry expert resources such as Sea Alarm and GOWRS, nationally operating OSROs such as AMOSC in Australia and ATRAC, technical advisory groups such as SINTEF, NOAA in North America, and ITOP. What we did in this workshop is we emphasized the value of the IPECA Good Practice Guides, which are 3 of them right here indicated in these images. And some key lessons learned through all of this. It's important to have eyes in the field, needing to know what you're dealing with in order to properly prepare for surveillance on the air, in the air, on water, and on the ground. Using pre-planning tools, contingency plans, and species indices to identify potential sensitive habitats, resources, and risks quickly in the process. Utilizing local resources. Local knowledge of seasonal variability in species use and resource availability is vital. Working with the local fishermen or national park representatives, that's really, really important for being able to get a good handle on what we're dealing with. Utilizing GIS and common operating picture, tools that drive communication and understanding across the response. Again, communication is vital. And then documentation. We don't want to get buried by all the documentation. Identify early on a method and responsible personnel for documenting the actions, observations, and results. Data will be needed to feed the ICS and IMS management. It's important that the unified command understand what's going on out there. Some other key lessons learned: response is flexible and scalable. Sometimes you might have a small response, so you only need a small rehabilitation facility, or that facility can quickly grow into something that would fill a warehouse or a large field, be it a football field, soccer field, something to that effect. Preparation and training are key to a response. Getting your responders together to know how to deal with these things periodically is important. And then sharing and communicating information via a common operating picture, putting it up on the big screen so that anyone that walks into the incident command location, that they know what's going on at a quick little glance. And then some additional training and resources. These are just some links, and I believe this will be supplied after this seminar webinar. But we have best practices for migratory bird care from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Marine Mammals Spill Response, and then the IPCA documents that were shown in images earlier that are the good practices for wildlife response and preparedness, and then the key principles for protecting wildlife. And with that, I'm going to hand off to my good friend and colleague, Mike Siccardi from the Oil Wildlife Care Network and UC Davis.
Great, thanks, Rich. Just confirming that my slides are on the screen. Is that correct?
Yes, looking good, Mike.
Great, thank you. What I'm going to do is to take the excellent information that Rich has provided and take it more into action. What's actually happening at the command post, where the rubber meets the road, if you will. So really the goals of my presentation today is to take this very complex process that we've been talking about related to wildlife response and hopefully kind of distill it down into the key details that need to be needed. And how this is going to be done, again, a lot of information is really looking back at some of those documents that Rich has talked about. One of the ones I'm going to be emphasizing today is another IPCA Good Practice Guide Incident Management System. And really what we're going to be talking about is the figure in the bottom right, also known as the Planning P. So really what the Planning P does is it allows an organized process by which the different phases of response can occur, starting with an initial response phase, also known as a reactive phase or the emergency phase. And I'm going to be using the reactive phase for the rest of it. What this really is when an incident first starts, some of those key things that need to happen. After the initial response, we then move into an operational phase, also known as a proactive or project phase. And what we do is we circle around this upper part of the Planning P, known as the operational O, and we keep going on daily operational activities. But what this does is it allows an organized approach to making sure plans are done, and specifically an incident action plan is developed for each operational period. Now, a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about do relate to major large-scale responses. It's important to note that this Planning P, or the planning cycle, is not always used in its entirety. As Rich said, you have very small incidents all the way up to very large ones. So it may just be that the initial reactive phase types of activities are all that's needed within a planning cycle. But really having an understanding of how everything works within the overall operation planning cycle, etc., is very important for all sizes of incidents. Now, within this reactive phase, that's when the incident occurs, the initial notifications occur, etc. It's really when we're starting to understand the situation. Operational activities, cleanup activities, environmental risk, etc. On the wildlife side, we're trying to understand what animals may be at greatest risk. We're identifying the communication routes. Who needs to know what when? So the assessment, the notifications, and the activation. And really what we're starting to do is to evaluate the necessary resources and getting them on the scene to be able to start mobilization as quickly as possible. So within that initial communications on the wildlife side, oftentimes what we're talking about is the organizations that are notified are usually the ones first and foremost that are in the response plan, the detailed response plan that Rich talked about, but also organizations that have legal authority, organizations that have a regional presence, local rehabilitation or wildlife professional organizations, maybe an organization with an existing relationship with a spiller in that area, or simply an organization who is available, depending on the number of incidents that might be occurring. Why these things occur, why do the communications happen? Really, we want the communications to occur as early as possible when wildlife are either at risk or affected. We don't want to wait for oiled animals to be in hand before the notifications occur. Early notification, activation, mobilization is extremely important because it's good for the animals, but we also have a huge number of things within the wildlife branch that has to happen. Getting approvals from the key agencies, getting veterinary approval depending on the country or the location. All of those things have to happen early. Now, some of the initial wildlife branch objectives, once the incident starts, is to implement that regional wildlife response plan that Rich was talking about, if present. Not all regions, not all locations have the pre-planning that have occurred, but if it's there, we definitely want to use that. We need to identify, request, and mobilize personnel. Same thing for equipment and facilities. We need to make sure that the notifications are done both internal and external. Internal within all the IMS structure that exists, but also external for key stakeholders. And then taking that information, we want to begin an incident-specific wildlife plan. So taking the large-scale pre-planning that occur and breaking it down into an incident-specific, product-specific, very detailed location-specific information, etc. So that can go into the overall incident action plan. We need to think about the response functions, the primary, keeping the oil away from the animals, the secondary, keeping animals away from the oil, and the tertiary, if those two don't work, the actual capture and rehabilitation of animals. We also want to be thinking about response scale, whether it's regional, a local, regional, or international in scope. Now, some of these initial steps have to happen very quickly to be able to institute an effective wildlife response. So developing that reconnaissance plan, first and foremost, getting people out there, getting information back so that we know what animals are at risk. So this may be very brief initially, coordinating with the environmental unit and flight operations, because there's a whole host of other flight activities that might be going on. What we need is key data specifically at the time of the incident. Our overall wildlife response plan may say that these 15 species are known to be in this area at this time of year. What we need to know is what is exactly out there. We then need to develop a recovery and transportation plan. Now, this initially may be informal, sending 3 teams of 3 individuals out to cover these geographic locations, etc. It'll become much more detailed later on. We're developing an initial stabilization and care plan. Typically, in most regions, there isn't a facility ready to go at the start of a response. So coming up with a plan for if animals are captured, where they're going to go to get that initial first aid that is necessary for animal care. Developing the initial rehabilitation plan. That may be integration of local rehab centers. They may not be oil experienced or knowledgeable, but it's actually a site where animals can start to go before another facility is developed or that facility is modified. We need to establish a hotline and a plan for volunteers. We need the ability to have members of the public call in reports of animals so we know how best to design our tactics within recovery and transportation. We need to establish opportunistic carcass protocol for response personnel. We have cleanup operators all through the theater of operations. They're going to likely, for large-scale events, they're likely going to come across animals that have died. What we need to do is to develop a plan so that those animals can be collected and quantified during an incident. We need to make sure we're providing the best information possible to the public information officer so that the messaging to the public and the messaging within the incident command system is accurate. And last, again, we need to be drafting a formal incident-specific wildlife plan, but that may be later on in the process. We do need to get people out there going as quickly as possible. Now, some of those initial resources we're talking about, equipment and supplies, types, thinking about capture equipment, rehabilitation equipment, again, thinking about those initial facilities, all the different elements that are required in an effective wildlife response facility. Thinking about how we can order resources, whether or not rehabilitation organizations bring them on scene, or whether we need to actually formally request them through the IMS structure. We need to think about contracting, thinking about reimbursement for expenses, all the different things that constitute professional oil spill response. Thinking about the staffing, emphasis early on field response, getting those animals out of the field and into care if tertiary wildlife response is necessary. Thinking about staffing and volunteers, whether or not there's local capacity, whether there's regional capacity or an international need to bring people in. And also thinking about staffing, getting your initial group of individuals on scene, but when do you expand that? When do you contract that? Thinking about the scalability of the response. Now, as facilities are being designed, there's a whole host of things that need to be considered. Environmental issues, whether or not you can control the temperature, the air exchanges, etc. Water, electricity, waste stream, housing, both indoor and outdoor, zoning. How do you keep a hot zone away from the cold zone, so areas where animals actually have oil on them? Thinking about the species that might be affected and how animals would flow through a facility to be able to make it an efficient response. All of those things that absolutely have to be thought about when facilities are being designed. Another thing that's really important to think about early in the response is reporting, whether reporting of animal numbers is done on a daily basis or a more elaborate process. Now, this is a form in the US that is used. It's called the ICS 209 form, which is really kind of a situation status form, etc. There is a section of that that does have information on animals that have been captured, that have been cleaned, have been released, animals that are dead on arrival, etc. It is one way to be able to quantify the effects of oil on animals. But again, this is going to depend specifically on the region where the spill occurs. It's very important early on to define exactly what the incident command needs from a wildlife response. Now, moving from that initial reactive phase to the proactive phase, so thinking about at each operational period those activities that need to occur. In this situation, this is where we're going to be finalizing the incident-specific plan. Initially, it was getting resources on scene. Now we're absolutely making sure that the plan is in place and people understand it. We're coordinating with the other sections within the incident. We're providing briefings as necessary to the unified command or incident commander and the different sections, supervising the branch and conducting operations per the incident action plan. So the overall incident plan itself, making sure that our requests for resources are met, and we're making sure we're right sizing the wildlife branch, so expanding it or contracting it as the need might be. Now, the wildlife branch is going to interact with all the different sections. As Rich said, we're typically in operations, but there's a close connectivity between operations and planning, and really those two for wildlife activities work hand in hand. But we're making sure we're communicating with the command structure, so the incident command, making sure they have the information they need, but also the information officer, the safety officer, the liaison officer to get the information we need. In planning, not only are we working with the wildlife planners, but we're also working with experts looking at species at risk or some of the risks related to the cleanup activities, especially if they involve alternative response techniques such as in situ burn, dispersant use, etc. The situation unit is going to be where we're submitting animal numbers, and resources unit is where we may have a volunteer coordinator within the planning section. Logistics, how we're getting the resources we need, and admin and finance, obviously going to be cost recovery. Now, within this incident-specific wildlife plan, there's a whole host of templates that are out there. The one I will point out right here, and this is the URL for that. State of Alaska has gone through a very extensive review of their wildlife activities. This is actually one that just came online this past year, but it's a PDF fillable form that does a really, really good job in leading individuals through the different steps that are necessary for an incident-specific wildlife plan. So I highly encourage you to go to this. It's freely available, but it can go through a lot of those different elements. But again, within that incident-specific wildlife plan, what we're doing is taking the pieces that Rich had talked about related to the overall pre-planning wildlife plan, and we're honing in on the incident-specific elements as far as the notifications, approvals, the geographic extent, the specific response strategies that might be used, and all the different elements that exist specifically for this spill. Now, there are a couple of different elements within the operational O that wildlife are particularly involved with. One is the tactics, both the pre-tactics meeting and the tactics meeting. What that is going to do is it's going to make sure that the wildlife activities are fully integrated within the overall response structure, and we get the resources we need to make sure that we can do the best job possible. So this is a form that is used, again, in the US, ICS 215. This is a pre-tactics operational worksheet. But what this allows us to do is to really identify the resources that are necessary to be able to conduct the operational activities that we need to do. And again, this is just one model to be able to use. Each incident is going to be very different related to what is actually used. But that information can then go into the planning meetings and getting ready to make sure that what we are doing is actually fully integrated and approved by the overall IMS structure. Again, very important that wildlife response is completely integrated as much as possible within the incident. The days of a wildlife rehab center closing its doors and existing completely separate from the overall incident are really gone as far as professional response. Part of this is also developing assignments that are specific so everybody understands who is doing what where. So again, this is another example of a form that's used in the US. This is the assignment list, or ICS 204. Which is for one of the incidents in California we use to really detail some of those work assignments that are necessary. Identifying who is responsible, identifying contact information, and some of the generalized information on work assignments. This allows response to occur in a very organized fashion. So this operational O, depending on the size of response, it's the daily activities through the response. And some days it looks like this. And other days, it looks more like this. But it's very important to make sure, again, that those operations can occur on a daily basis so we can make sure we're doing what we need for the wildlife overall. So really a conclusion of mine, wildlife activities during a large-scale incident can be complex. That first figure I showed you as far as the organizational chart, absolutely complex, but it doesn't have to be complicated. There can be an organized accomplishment of activities that everybody is knowledgeable of and everybody is on board with to make sure that we're doing the best thing for the animals. Through pre-planning and adherence to the IMS tenets, wildlife response can be an absolute integral part of the overall response.
Thank you very much, Mike. Fantastic presentation, and yes, so obviously, as many responders know, we're always needing to adapt to changing circumstances in an incident. Today, our changing circumstances has been some challenges that our third speaker had connecting to Teams to present. But that shouldn't stop us running this today. Hopefully, through the magic of another platform, Valeria's here on audio with me, so I'm going to share her slides and invite Valeria to go ahead and give her presentation.
Good morning, everyone. So I will start my bits by summarizing my topics for the coming slides. Today, I will focus on emphasizing wildlife response as an evolving field, discuss some of the main challenges in international wildlife response, show some of the current picture of global preparedness, and what we should do together, working towards a good practice approach with main conclusions at the end. As many of you know, historically, wildlife response was not included in incident management systems in many parts of the world. It's been mainly NGO driven and funded with national and international cooperation during incidents. In the United States, organizations like International Bird Rescue, Tri-State Bird Rescue, the OWCN, the Oil Wildlife Care Network, have been able to evolve as a result of the fact that oil wildlife response has been more recognized. Their work, the relationship with IFAW during international responses, and the support to the effects of oil on wildlife conferences have helped to create international growth in the last 25 years. The countries have also looked at the US structure to create national frameworks, for example, in Brazil, New Zealand, and certain countries in Europe. There has also been industry recognition globally with the Sea Alarm technical advice available to OSRL members for 16 years now. And post-Montara and Macondo, the joint industry projects were created. There has been recognition to oil wildlife response through the tier preparedness and response wheel, and also through the creation of the Global Oil Wildlife System Response System Project. So today my goal is to focus on 4 main incident management challenges that are commonly presented in the international wildlife response. First topic relates to operation and planning. So having poor integration with the incident management system is a main issue faced in international responses historically, as I mentioned in my previous slide. Having limited response plans in place will consequently lead to delays in initiating response strategies. It is common to have lack of coordination between the different stakeholders. With regards to resources, equipment, and trained personnel are also a big challenge in wildlife response. And many of these challenges were experienced in the Eider spill in Chile and the Bojubel spill in the Netherlands. Talking about field and capture challenges, which is my number 2 topic, safety challenges are really common, and it's difficult to guarantee personnel safety, especially when there is poor integration with the incident command. Having logistic support creates delays and also leads to the lack of potential wildlife impact data. And that is common, very common situation in mystery spills. Also a good example is the Arturo Illia spill in Argentina, when we have rehabilitated around 700 animals, but we had another 700 animals that were located in a different spot that was not monitored by the wildlife responders. Talking about number 3, facility challenges are also a main issue in wildlife response, especially when there isn't no pre-identified resources. There are chaotic efforts to establish rehabilitation facilities, and also resource challenges because you need to acquire all the different supplies for the animal response. Giving 2 examples of facility challenges in the real world, we had the Prestige spill in Spain when we had to set up a facility, a wildlife response facility in a forest fire station, and that was away from the ocean, and it was difficult to get the animals over there. And on the picture to your right, you can see the Gloma River response. Considering that we had to locate a facility where we could adapt the entire rehabilitation process indoors because it was winter in Norway. We needed the pools inside tents so the pool water wouldn't freeze. Incident management number 4, then we can consider animal care challenges. When we are dealing with lives, with animals' lives, there's a window of opportunity. So we have a certain time to be able to rehabilitate the animals, and that time starts counting once the animals are oiled. We need also to consider animal welfare is also a big issue. So euthanasia decisions and policies also need to be considered, and always implementing good practice. The main example I have for this is the Cabo Virgenes mystery spill, when we had to fly north 400 penguins in the C-130 to finalize their waterproofing due to facility limitations, and also to guarantee their welfare. Another example is the Prestige spill and the Rena spill. We can cite those 2 in regards with euthanasia decision and policies. In the Prestige, the team had to euthanize animals that had aspergillosis while working with volunteers. During the Rena spill, there were several cultural challenges, and the indigenous people had to agree with euthanizing animals in poor health. So although inclusion of the wildlife response in IMS is well established in certain countries, if we zoom out and look globally, it is a very, very mixed picture. It's easy to assume that everything is integrated when it might not be the case. National systems and stakeholder roles may vary, and we don't always have a unified command approach. There are limited response preparedness in many countries and regions, with wildlife response plans not always in place. And there's also limited Tier 1 and Tier 2 preparedness. The sea alarm map below that you can see on the picture to your lower right indicates that variation between the different countries on sea alarms viewed through the OSRL country profiles. In the last decade or more, there has been significant developments to try and address that gap of not enough preparedness, and the industry has defined good practice. First, through the inclusion of the oiled wildlife response in the incident management system within the tier preparedness and response wheel, as I mentioned before. Then supporting the development of the global oiled wildlife response system project, first through IPCA and later through OSRL. The project defined response and animal care principles and also developed a generic wildlife branch organization. Next slide. So in parallel with industry good practice, there has also been changes on a country level and I can cite Brazil as an example for that. It shows a proactive approach to integrate wildlife in the incident management system. So oil wildlife response is a federal requirement on operators permits. All the operators had to adopt ICS. And when we talk about the wildlife branch in practice, there are wildlife personnel within the operations section and also wildlife specialists within the planning section. All exercises do include wildlife response. And you can see a few examples below, the pictures of Shell Brazil and also an exercise for Petrobras on the right picture. And also good examples, we can cite Equinor and lots of different operators in Brazil. And also as a good example of good practice approach, we had the ExxonMobil exercise that invited the Global Oil Wildlife Response System in Malaysia. Next slide, please, Paul. So exercises like the ones on the previous slide are examples of the good practice approach to build preparedness. The recommendations that came out of the Gowers project are really about thinking of the different elements of the response and how to create meaningful exercises. Those being on a large scale or taking specific modules as seen on the image below, or the Global Oil Wildlife Response System recommendations as a modular approach, or whether it is a wildlife specific event or integrated into an industry exercise, but essentially we use it as a way to understand and improve the incident management of a wildlife response. Next slide, please, Paul. Quickly introducing the Gowers Tier 3 Wildlife Assessment Team concept. As a legacy from the Gowers project, the global network is now proposing a guaranteed Tier 3 assessment team, which, if funded by the industry, will be available as an OSRL supplementary service in a 4x4 system with 4 people for 4 days at no cost to hiring. The concept behind this service is recognizing that some of the global challenges of oil wildlife response that I just mentioned in my previous slides enable international experts to act as a force multiplier in the early days of a response in terms of operations and planning, field capture, and a rehabilitation specialist according to the variables of the response. The fourth expert can be either a veterinarian or a taxa specialist like a reptile or a marine mammal expert, for example. Next slide, please, Paul. So looking closely at the team's functions, the assessment team is designed to help address and propose feasible strategies for the response. So the wildlife ops and planning specialists be there to fortify the command structure. The field capture specialist will assess the spill site dynamics, and I have listed some of the other activities that will be developed by these professionals in the field. The rehab and facility specialist will assess the local capacity, and the veterinarian or the incident specific specialist will bring critical expertise to the needs of the response. Next slide, please, Paul. So mentioning the future priorities for industry, getting Gowers is a great way forward. However, it's important to say that the Gowers assessment team is obviously not solving all the global preparedness issues. It is a great additional way to address the global challenges, but it's only a piece of the puzzle. The recent Cyprus workshop hosted by IPICA and facilitated by CLARN and Gowers organizations in 2019 has identified some of the future priorities for the industry and other stakeholders to implement tiered preparedness for wildlife. You can find a summary of those recommendations listed here, divided in different levels for the oil companies, between the corporate level and the business unit level, and also with recommendations for the industry service providers and expert resources. Slide, please, Paul, to conclude. So we can't emphasize enough the importance of proactive preparedness efforts with implemented wildlife response plans, understanding the wildlife branch and the needs from the wider incident management. There's the need to include wildlife objectives in all exercises organized by the industry. Implement Tier 1 and Tier 2 capability with the key stakeholders always. We need to work towards a unified approach, including all the participants, because in an ideal world, yes, you do have a plan, you do have a structure, you train and exercise, ensuring local response with Tier 1 and Tier 2 being assured by the Tier 3 framework. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Yeah, really appreciate you doing that with the technical challenges as well. Hopefully it didn't take away from the quality of those slides and the presentation for those that are listening in. And just also note and apologies that we're running a little bit over, obviously, with the technical issues that we had. This session will be recorded and it will be made available. So feel free to, if you do need to leave, we'll make sure that you have a link to that recording. If you can stay with us, we'll try to make sure that we answer just a couple of the questions that have been coming through in the chat. Yes, lots of questions that came through. Maybe starting at the top here, just one for Rich, just to start off with. Rodrigo from Petrobras, it's quite clear that a wildlife branch is needed during a spill where there is a wildlife contamination. I'm not sure if the same structure is needed in the beginning of a spill. Can you describe what would be a good wildlife response structure in IMS in the first days of a spill where there is no contaminated or threatened wildlife? So Rich, you want to take that one first?
Sure. Obviously, what you'll have is probably a single person. You'll have a wildlife branch director operating to figure out what's going to happen. And if anything does happen, you're going to be notifying potential wildlife response organizations. That actually happened to me in an incident. I was the first one there. We had no impact yet, but we got a wildlife response organization on standby. So you kind of get a straw man of what you're going to do to respond, but you don't necessarily stand up anything at that moment.
Thank you, Richard. And maybe just a quick follow-on question for you before I ask one to Mike, because it's related. So what should be done first by an oil and gas company to improve its wildlife response preparedness? So yeah, it seems like a good follow-up question.
Yes, thanks, Barbara, for that, because I was monitoring the questions to get ahead of this. So basically what the first step would be to work with the operational sites, get a basic pre-plan in place for things like, most important, notifications. Who are you going to call should you have a wildlife response? Maybe a basic equipment package for handling any wildlife that's impacted early on, and get some training from qualified people like Mike's organization or Valeria's organization, and also have a list of what potential species you may encounter early on. All the information that you can gather beforehand certainly makes the job easier once you have an incident.
Great, thanks very much, Rich. So just, moving on to a couple other questions here. So Mike, question for you, I think here. So I would like to understand more clearly the difference between rehabilitation and stabilization, which are shown as two separate functions inside the wildlife branch.
Yeah, so it's a good question, because in the past we've talked about stabilization as part of the rehabilitation process. Really, how we're differentiating field stabilization versus rehabilitation is really field stabilization is more the first aid that occurs to animals when they first come out of the environment. So the initial care, so it's not full rehabilitation, no cleaning, no pre-release conditioning, etc. It's really getting fluids, animals getting warmed, starting to provide that first aid. So if you think of the TV show MASH, it's the difference between the MASH unit in the field versus a general hospital. So it's getting them care as early as possible.
Great, thank you, Mike. A question from Lucas Hassel here, and Lucas, I hope I get this correct, but I think what your question's asking is, having a good practice approach in terms of the principles and protection, but also understanding the sort of local requirements and regulations. So I think this question of having those sort of hands-on procedures available, but also should they and how should they be adapted to those sort of local conditions and sort of regulatory requirements.
Do you want me to take that one, Rich?
Yeah, Mike, if I can ask you to take that one, and then I'll pass on to Valeria.
Sure. It's an excellent question, because obviously different techniques, different resource availabilities are going to differ throughout the world. It's one of the things that we really tried to integrate within our key principles document, the IPICA document that Rich was talking about. Is really what we try to do within that document is to identify those things that are absolutely essential in animal care and those things that are desirable. So the essential elements are the things that it doesn't matter which organization, which individual, what location you're at, those key elements of overall tertiary response that are necessary for a professional response. How that happens is a little bit more up to the organization itself, but there are some key elements related to humane care of animals that have to happen. And so with that document, I definitely refer you to that to look at some of the differences in that.
Great, thanks very much, Mike. And then Valeria, hopefully you're still online here with me. So there was a question about your field capture challenges. So you're number 2 with incident management challenges. So the question is if you could elaborate on the logistics support issues and also ways of correcting these issues for both the logistics and field information.
Sure.
Paul, you can't mute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, just start that again, Valeria. Still getting used to the fact that you're coming through my speakers. Go ahead.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your question, Joy. So when I talk about logistics support, also ways to, your question obviously is ways to correct those issues. So ideally, the wildlife response needs to have logistics support for transporting animals in and out of the field into rehab. Also having logistics support to capture, to locate and capture animals in the field. Also for monitoring the beaches, aerial monitoring to be able to identify where the affected animals are. So that is the logistics support that I mentioned as a challenge in wildlife response, because if you're not connected to the major incident management, the wildlife response doesn't necessarily have all the needs and identified to be able to locate and transport these animals into rehabilitation.
Thank you very much, Valeria. Yeah, Mike, Rich, anything you wanted to add to that one? I think this will probably be our last question. So,
I think the only thing to add is that just like every part of oil spill response, right, the logistics chain is really oftentimes the most challenging one. And one of the issues with wildlife operations is oftentimes we utilize equipment and supplies that are very different than the rest of the incident. Most logistics chiefs understand what boom is and what, you know, as far as cleanup activities, rakes, etc. But if we ask for a bird net, everybody's going to have a different interpretation of that. So it's really, really important to establish that communication with logistics early on so they really understand what specifically the wildlife operations need.
Yeah, and logistically, depending on where you are in the world, you know, if you are in, say, North America, the U.S. in particular, you may be able to go to a local supply store and get something that would be suitable. But if you're in, say, Angola, or you're in Georgetown, Guyana, that may not be the case. But the good thing is that wildlife responders are very good at adapting the things that they need for the job they have to do. And that's why we have them around, and that's why we work with them.
Thank you, Rich. I think you might very well said. Yeah, Valeria has certainly been doing that to present today. You know, we've got to work with what's in front of us. So yeah, we're coming to the end here. Hopefully you can see my last slide here. So just a final few things to mention. First of all, if you are interested to watch more wildlife response webinars, we have been running a series of these. They're available as recordings on the Oil Spill Response website. If you registered for this website, you will actually, for this webinar, you will get a link to that recording. But please feel free to go to the technical library. There's a great webinar delivered by CLR, OSRL's technical advisors who deliver the SLA services on those SLA services. There's a webinar which goes into more detail about this Gowers assessment team as well. So please check those out. You can also, find information on the current SLA wildlife services that OSRL offers, as well as information on that proposed Gowers supplementary service that Valeria was talking about and how to sign up. So please take a look at that. And also look out for future announcements about wildlife webinars. We're certainly going to hope to keep this series going. Hopefully we'll improve the sort of technical issues for next time. But like I said, we hopefully that didn't affect the ability to take away, some of the great messages from our presenters today. I think the last thing just to say is if you're an OSRL member and you would be interested in participating in the community of practice meetings, or if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And finally, just a huge thanks to our three presenters today, and also a mention to Anne-Laure Szymanski from Equinor and Louise Chills from Massey University, who also helped with the content development. That's all for me. Thank you very much. Thanks for staying with us, and see you next time. Bye for now.